Hey everybody, Pastor Aaron here. Just wanted to give you our next lesson in our line of lessons out of the book of Genesis. We are looking at a creator, who that creator is, how his design works, and now today we're going to be in Genesis 3 talking about how Adam and Eve were the first, but of many, to stray from that design of an all-knowing, all-loving creator. You know, I have a pastor friend that I know, and he said that he became a Christian in high school. Well, he became a Christian one weekend in high school. He was 17 years old, and there was this girl he had always had a crush on. He's at school Monday or Tuesday of the next week, and she is there. He's had a crush on her for years. They've never really spoken more than a few words to each other. And all of a sudden, that day, she comes up to him and says, hey, what are you doing this weekend? And he's like, nothing. Basically, probably like, whatever you want to do. And she says, well, my parents have a cabin up in the north part of the state, and they're going to be out of town. They're going to the cabin. I didn't know if you wanted to come over to my house and hang out a little bit. And he's just like, what? I've never talked to this girl before, or very rarely. I've had a crush on her. She's cute. But our paths have never crossed. And he politely declined, of course, because he didn't really know what was going on. But he walked away from that interaction going, man, if there's not a devil and that wasn't a setup, then I don't know what is. Very often temptation is used by the devil to see if he can trip us up, to see if he can make us stray against design. As we look at God's design in Genesis 1 and 2, those chapters, we see that, man, God is incredible, and he gave us this chance. He gave us the instructions, basically, to not mess things up. But then Adam and Eve came along, and all of a sudden there's this serpent in the garden. There's this snake in the grass that we know is probably we know is Satan. We know it is the tempter. We know it is the fallen Lucifer, because snakes don't usually talk. Even in the early garden, snakes don't talk. Adam wouldn't have had to go around naming all the animals if the animals talked at the beginning, because the animals could have just said, Adam could have just said, hey, what's your name? And a giraffe could have said, well, I like to call myself Giraffe. Very often we think, oh, well, maybe that serpent spoke because that was a thing that they did back. No, the serpent spoke because the serpent was being used by Satan. And so we see this. We see that you have to remember that every sin that comes along, you have to remember that sins both internally and externally, some of them from us and our fleshly desires, or our tempers, or our fill in the blank. Some of them external, though, situations, circumstances that are tempting. What you need to remember, though, is that sin is always a setup. Sin is always a setup. We see this in chapter 3, verses 1 through 6. We see that it's very obvious that we do struggle against a tempter. It says this, now the serpent, in verse 1, was the most cunning of all wild animals that the Lord God had made. He said to the woman, did God really say you can't eat from any tree in the garden? The woman said to the serpent, we may eat of the fruit of the trees in the garden, but about the fruit of the tree in the middle of the garden, God said, you must not eat it or touch it, or you will die. No, you will not die, the serpent said to the woman. In fact, God knows that when you eat it, your eyes will be open, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. Then the woman saw that the tree was good for food and delightful to look at, and that it was desirable for obtaining wisdom. As we look at this, we see that all of a sudden, through persuasion, Eve's eyes were changed. Eve looked at the tree, and all of a sudden, man, that looks really good. That really, all of a sudden, the words of the tempter changed her mind. And so we see that she gave in. Some of you know that I like Star Wars, and especially Return of the Jedi, the third of the original trilogy. When there's Admiral Akbar. He's like the weird looking dude with he kind of looks fishish, and they all of a sudden realize that they've been called into this rebel fight with the empire, and they've been called to this certain area because it's a trap. And that's one of my favorite lines that he says, actually. It's a trap. And he wants everybody to turn around. Eve didn't know that it was a trap. In fact, she was persuaded that the tree looked good. And even though God had said that, God didn't really mean what he said. And how often do we just think, oh, well, God designed something a certain way. The Bible is very clear about what it says about certain designs. But God didn't really mean it that way. Or he's not going to really... there's no real consequences. God just doesn't want us to do it. He doesn't want us to have fun, or he doesn't want us to be smart or have that knowledge. And so we see that sin is a setup, and we can know that because we struggle against a tempter. The other thing you have to remember is that giving into temptation brings consequences. Very often we think, oh, well, if I commit that sin, I'm going to be okay. I'll probably get away with it. There probably won't be any consequences. And so it says this, though, in verses 6 through 13. Then the woman saw that the tree was good for food and delightful to look at, that it was desirable for obtaining wisdom. We saw that. So she took some of its fruit and ate it. She also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate it. Then the eyes of both of them were opened, and they knew they were naked. So they sewed fig leaves together and made loincloths for themselves. Then the man and his wife heard the sound of the Lord God walking in the garden at the time of the evening breeze. Awkward. All of a sudden they're wearing clothes and God's coming. And they've already eaten that fruit. And they hid themselves from the Lord God among the trees of the garden. So at the time of the evening breeze, they hid themselves from the Lord God among the trees of the garden. So that the Lord God called out to the man and said to him, "Where are you?" He said, "I heard you in the garden, and I was afraid, and I was naked, so I hid," said Adam. Then he asked, "Who told you that you were naked? Did you eat from the tree that I commanded you to eat, not to eat from?" Then the man replied, "The woman gave it to me. She gave me some fruit from the tree, and I ate." So the Lord asked the woman, "What is this you have done?" And the woman said, "It was the serpent. He deceived me, and I ate." We often want to do our own thing when it comes to our decisions. We want to do our own thing, but yet we don't want to face the consequences if they turn out bad. We want all the praise, we want all the rewards if it's good, but if the consequences are bad, that's when we can't handle it. And we see the buck keeps getting passed, right? So Adam's like, "Oh, yeah, God, we did eat from the tree, but Eve was the one that gave me the fruit, so I think she's at fault." It goes to Eve, and Eve's like, "Oh, yes, I ate from the tree, but it's really not my fault. It's the serpent's fault." And God knows this whole time. He's asking questions to get them to talk. Who told you were naked? Did you eat from that tree? He knew, and the consequences then would be served, and eventually Adam and Eve will be kicked out of the garden. Birth will be painful. The ground will have to be toiled for it to grow and produce things, and we know what happened. Jesus also went through temptation. Jesus also bore the brunt of temptation. He just didn't go through half the temptation and then give in. And so he only experienced half the temptation for us in many different ways. Temptation for power, temptation when he was hungry, starving, physical well-being, temptation for bumping up his pride and people worshiping him. And Jesus existed through all those temptations and never gave in, came out the other side. He bore the brunt of temptation to show that we always have an out. We can always trust in him to get us out of temptation. Hebrews 2:17 through 18 says this: "Therefore he had to be like his brothers in every way, so that he could become a merciful, faithful high priest in service to God, to make propitiation," which means stand in, "for the sins of the people. For since he himself was tested and he has suffered, he is able to help those who are tested." The only help you can have against Satan and to make yourself right with God is to know Jesus Christ and depend on him for deliverance from temptation. So, do you have Jesus, and do you have his help when it comes to temptation? Read through Genesis 3, and thanks for listening.